You want an urban crossover experience? Well, that's what the Lexus UX is supposed to do. Chief Engineer Shika Kakao was responsible for this project. She's a VP inside of Lexus. She's responsible for the touch interface or the mousepad interface for their infotainment, and now this. And being a female engineer or chief engineer in the automotive world is extremely rare. So I took great interest to see kind of what her ideas were, where she was coming from, and the good and bad that was implemented here. So let's get started on the exterior. Now, designers and artists love to play with shapes, lines, geometry, namely with light in a studio environment. You can take something that looks mundane and make it look like a piece of art. And I do this all the time with my video work. But in the real world, sometimes it doesn't play out like how you imagined it. These massive wheel arches that are unpainted black plastic, it runs all the way under the rocker panel to the front. And what they claim they did here is they didn't paint it because if they painted it, it reduces the volume. It reduces the perceived height of the vehicle, and it would make it look more like a compact car or a hatchback, which is exactly what they're trying to avoid. Now, the entire exterior is not all doom and gloom because Toyota is good with advanced composites and other lightweight materials. The hood is aluminum, the fenders, the doors, the rear hatch has an aluminum frame with a T-SOP shell, which is Toyota Super Olefin Polymer, which is a form of polypropylene. It's strong, it's impact resistant, and it's lightweight. So they're trying to keep the weight down, and all of this is probably, based on my weight calculation, saves about 300 pounds. So there is some thought to design keeping weight down and making it efficient, because that's what Toyota is really focused on. With many F-Sport models, there are some differences, like the grille, the badging, the wheels, and I think, the exterior is just what it is. But I think the main home run here, what they did extremely well for the price point is the interior space, so let's take a look at that. Now, the interior space is something that they should be proud of, and I think that they are. For this $35,000 price range, this should be an example to other manufacturers on how to do certain things, like material choice. There is no piano gloss plastic in here. And what do they replace it with? A matte black plastic that looks like it has a machined texture to it, almost like machined aluminum. But every texture in here is either a matte or soft touch gray or a matte gray plastic. There is no fingerprints on anything in here or dust, unless it's, of course, on the infotainment screen. And I feel like this is going to age extremely well. With the F-Sport option, you get the red and black seats, which are definitely eye-catching. I don't know that it matches the personality of what this thing is, but the interior space as a whole looks great. Now, the chief engineer is 5'3". She said it's difficult to get into certain cars because when you get closer to the steering wheel, it's harder to use the controls. And I find myself sitting very close to the steering wheel as well. And you notice that when you get closer in certain cars, certain functions become inaccessible or harder to find. And I played around with seating position in here, and I think they did a really good job with that. Whether you're close, I can still reach the HVAC controls, which are stupid simple to use. When you're farther away, you still see all the core functions that you need to operate. The only negative thing about this, as much as it does look good for its price, they've run out of room to put certain things. So where you would expect to see a volume knob or a rotary tuning knob, doesn't exist. They've had to move it over here by the mouse control, which is just, it feels like an afterthought. And again, I can appreciate what they're trying to do with design, and you can also see the frustration here. It's like you have this blank canvas and you're like, we have to cram all of this stuff that people want in this small space. How do we do it? And certain things get put into less favorable locations, or like you couldn't put every single HVAC control in here, so you have to go into the infotainment screen to go navigate there. And that's the stuff that frustrates me. But for the most part, this interior space is excellent in terms of layout. Now, the backseat space, this is where I start to get frustrated with these types of vehicles, because this is supposed to be some type of like utility or practical vehicle, and there's literally no backseat room. It feels so upright, so uncomfortable, so claustrophobic. Why wouldn't you just buy a sedan or a regular hatchback if you have to have this much compromise? Now, you know why, really, and I'm going to talk about this in the shop, but for the most part, there's other vehicles that this is built on. There is more headroom here. You don't feel like you're gonna crack your head in this thing every time you get into it. But for the most part, this is usable for really small people in the back, or it's kind of like a two-seater. The front seat space is where you enjoy it the most. All right, the cargo area. If this is bad, you can pretty much rule this vehicle out. When you open this up, the first thing you notice, it's got an electronic liftgate, which is important to many people that want to buy a luxury vehicle. When you look at this, it certainly makes sense now why the back seat space is so compromised. You have a huge cargo area. This is totally usable. This is what you expect like on a kind of a crossover vehicle. The height, the width, the load floor is good, and it's just easy to get things in and out of here. Now, this combined with the frontal interior area, the design and the seating comfort, this is kind of what makes this more of a compelling vehicle. But enough of that. Let's get into the shop and take a look at the underbody. I'm glad you've accepted the invitation to have a look at the underbody of the Lexus UX. Now, if you're one of the over 350,000 people that have watched my Toyota Corolla hatchback video, or the Prius Prime, or the CHR, you're gonna see something familiar here. This is Toyota's TNGA-C architecture, which is shared between all of those cars. They call it GAC for short. And when they start to make this modular architecture, this is what you get. All of those vehicles share the same body structure. This shares basically the same wheelbase as that CHR and the Corolla hatch. And when you look at the underbody, it's almost identical. Now, they're gonna make different tweaks, like to the subframe on this car, there are risers, there are spacers to give you a little bit of that extra ride height. And of course, they have to do some geometry changes. But mostly, the panels are very similar. They're almost identical in certain parts. And you're gonna see almost all the same things. And this is how they reduce costs, improve production efficiencies, and they can just release more products. So you might be wondering, well, why would I buy a Lexus if it's the same as other Toyota models? And they're doing something different here with the Toyota versions. And a lot of it has to do with making it more quiet. So you're gonna see heavier use of undercoatings, namely on the wheel wells. I mean, they build it up so much in the front wheel wells, it looks like somebody just took a bucket and threw it on there. And that's like the subtleties they use to quiet cars down. For the most part, all your other under panels are very similar. You have strut-based front suspension here, which the dampers have been retuned for the F-Sport model, and it's different than the other Toyota models. You get the F-Sport wheels, which is more aggressive, but I will say, and I don't say this a lot, these Bridgestone tires that they have on here are extremely good in snow and icy conditions. In fact, I was concerned about the ability of this thing to get through that and the traction. It felt almost like a mild snow tire, so I was super impressed with that. The handling is good. Let's take a look at the back end of this vehicle. Now, I reviewed my footage from the underbody section of the Corolla hatch, and this looks so similar. The control arms, the subframe carrier, the sway bars, and of course the exhaust. Now, there are subtle differences again. Your fender well liners are different. Some of these composite panels, these shapes are slightly different. The fuel tank is supposedly bigger in here. But the other nice thing, this does not have fake exhaust tips here. You can just see the exhaust exiting out. It doesn't have really anything fancy about it, which is kind of a nice change. But other than that, it's basically what you see on all the other GAC platform vehicles. Let's take a look under the hood. Under the hood of the UX, a 2-liter, it makes 169 horsepower, the same as the Corolla Hatch XSE. So what's different about it? Well, it's got the same CVT as well, with a physical first gear set, and then it hands it off to the traditional CVT. I feel like the biggest difference here is the way they have the CVT programmed, because the drive modes are a little bit different, and of course Lexus has to tweak the software that way. And I'm going to go into greater detail on how it switches modes and all that during the drive, and some of it you heard in the intro. But this is one of Toyota or Lexus's masterpiece 4-cylinders in terms of emissions or lowering emissions and fuel efficiency. And it does all of this on regular gasoline. And the second part is now they're using ULVs or ultra low viscosity oils like 0W16. In another 3 years, you're going to see 0W8. And right now, pretty much you're only going to get this at a Toyota dealership or Mobil 1. And again, these are all the tricks that they're using to try to get fuel economy better and better, squeak every last ounce out of the internal combustion engine. This is dual injection as well, port and direct. And there's so much technology in this motor that I could literally make a standalone video on it, which I'm not going to talk about anything more than that. Let's get this on the road and see how it drives. Ooh. Finally, I'm on the road in the new UX, having an urban adventure, a young professional budding with desires to explore the world. And what is it like? Well, I've been in the CHR, I've been in the Prius Prime, and I've been in the new Corolla Hatch, all which share the same architecture. It's basically the same type of ride quality. The main difference that you're going to notice is with the F-Sport, this is more firmly sprung. But it does maintain a lot of wheel travel, it does maintain a lot of comfort, and the steering seems to be a little bit more responsive and confidence-inspiring. The other thing that they've done here is they've boosted the brake pedal pressure, which means when you breathe on the brakes, it feels like it's going to stop immediately, and it's very sensitive, and it takes a little bit of getting adjusted to. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to stop like crazy, but everything about the driving experience is pretty immediate. Now, the main thing to note is this still has a pretty good compliant ride until you get over some bad pavement. And I've noticed when you hit sudden impacts or like a little bit bigger pothole or minor potholes or just almost like speed bump type bumps like these, it feels like the suspension does not have enough travel. I feel like at some point it's hitting bump stops and you get this huge shock into your seat. It's just not well sorted over really bad stuff. And you don't really expect it to be real about it. But for the most part, you're going to really kind of enjoy the driving experience if you're just tooling around. Now, the next part of driving the UX is, I feel like this vehicle is best driving at night. And the reason for that is it's the automotive equivalent of putting a paper bag over it. You don't know what you're in, you don't know what it looks like, and you kind of can just appreciate the interior space and the overall design of the architecture of the car, the underbody, some of the engine performance, and the transmission if you're not going flat out. And I think that's the worst part about this for me is you almost have to, or at least for me, I have to almost forget what I'm in to appreciate some of what this car is and what it's not. All right, the big thing about driving this is the direct shift CVT. And it essentially has a few different modes. It doesn't matter what drive mode you're in, sport, normal, or eco. It's based on how you use the accelerator pedal. So if I want to accelerate and I push the throttle down, it has this immediate downshift, but if you don't push it all the way to the floor past the detent, it will simulate fake shifts as though you're in a torque converted automatic. The only way to get this car to act like a true CVT is to push the pedal past that detent on the floor and mash it. It will accelerate once you get over first gear. It will no longer fake shift, and it will hold the RPM the entire time, and it sounds horrendous. Namely, when you have the fake engine tone on, it is so bad. Thank God you can defeat the fake engine noise in here because it's straight up synthesizer. So let's take a listen to this. First, using it with the fake shifts, next, using it accelerating past the detent and holding the RPMs like a traditional CVT. So I think all that can be said has been said. This is a very interesting car. It's definitely not one of my favorites that I've ever driven. I think they're piling a ton of technology in here. It's still efficient. I'm getting, over 30 miles to the gallon if I'm driving conservatively. It's a great interior space, but again, this is not the most inspiring drive. I feel like I would almost rather have certain hatchbacks or sedans that give you a lot of this same experience, but just better driving. But enough of that, let's get to the final thoughts. Final thoughts on the Lexus UX. And I said this at the beginning of the video, this is one of the very few vehicles that has a female chief engineer. Now, I've been in the workforce long enough to have been on both sides. I've been in a female-dominated area where I was the only guy, and been on the other extreme, like this one, where it's male-dominated. And sometimes when you bring in the opposite sex, it brings in that diversity, fresh ideas. And that's why I was so curious about this, and you can see it on the interior space in terms of material choice, design, placement of things, the seating configuration. It really is good, and that's this vehicle's highlight. Now, the negative part about it is they're trying to do too much with too little here. And this is built to a price point. They only had X amount of money. They had to be different than everybody else. And and you can see it on the exterior, and I had to bite my tongue so many times because this thing just looks like an overstyled mess when you look at it in person. I just can't stand it, and I don't know if you're gonna like it or not. If you do, you might really enjoy this. The interior almost offsets some of that. The drivability is pretty good. It is a little bit firm. It does have some issues with bad pavement or like hard impacts. I felt like the suspension would bottom out too easy. And the back seat room is totally compromised. But if you're really gonna use it as a 2-passenger vehicle, you like the interior design and the cargo or hatch space, it's pretty good. But for me, I just feel like there's too much compromise here for what they're trying to do that I don't know. Just take a look at it for yourself and make your own judgment. But hopefully you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.
This savage geese, I hate him, I hate him. I'm gonna show you how to get back at him on Yelp and all that other stuff.